So in the last class, I told you that the hidden solution, the hidden big issue of this chapter is in the bottom of page 51 that says that relatively recent evolutionary adaptations to new and localized environmental challenges have altered our visible phenotypes. The solution to the question of why is it, if we are such a one interbreeding species that likes to move around and migrate and trade and intermingle and get together with each other and interbreed so much, and we're so genetically the same, why do we still have all these physical differences around? And this is what we said was the answer. So in the last class, we learned about some genetic stuff, perhaps more than we wanted to learn. For me, it was really hard. It's really complicated. It's a hard reading to do because human genetics is super complex. We were taught about Punnett squares and those little recessive and dominant things, but it turns out any human trait, including things like dimples and eye color and whether we can roll our tongues or not, are often influenced by a bunch of cascading genes, a whole variety of things. And so this is why, it's one of the reasons why that we are able to be influenced by our environment in this way. Now, in this next section, we're first going to deal, in the first part of class, we're going to deal with the genetic adaptations that have come about as we moved into different areas. So we'll first deal with the basic genetic adaptations. And the second part of class, we'll deal with what is called the extended evolutionary synthesis, or things that are genetic, but not really. So these are classic genetic adaptations. And to understand this, we have to understand a couple things. First of all, that Homo sapiens, as our single interbreeding species that we are, come about around 300,000 years ago in Africa. So as we talked about in the last class, evolutionarily speaking, Homo sapiens are a fairly recent species. 300,000 years in evolutionary terms is very little. It's not that much. So we're a young species, evolutionarily speaking. And the way in which we look differently from each other, what they call the regional variations in phenotypes, or how we physically appear, come about around 50,000 years ago, both inside of Africa, because Africa is a huge continent and it has different climates as well, but also outside of Africa as Homo sapiens began to migrate into different parts of the world, different northern and colder regions, eastward and westward. And so we have both a young Homo sapiens species, evolutionarily speaking, and we also have these different phenotypes emerging quite recently in evolutionary terms. Now, we talked about also in the last class that the variations that we see, we'll talk about some of those, like, for example, skin color, or even percentage of people who identify as a certain blood type, OAB. The variations are what the biologists call clinal, which is a technical term that just means gradual or continual over a geographic range. So if you walk from one part of the world to the other, and you take your time and you go from one village or one city to the next, you'll see often a range of continuous variation in terms of human traits. We also saw in the last class that these traits combine independently. And this is one of the great advancements of Mendelian genetics, and that's why we do those Punnett squares and talk about dominant and recessive, because they are not packaged or linked together. You don't get all those traits as a child as one complete package from your parents. They combine and recombine in different people. So stuff like noses and lips and hair color and hair texture and curliness, that can all combine and recombine independently. So you can have people with light skin and dark skin with different facial features. You're not going to get one exact combination of traits for each that go together naturally with each other. Now, I want to talk about first what we see, but I also want to talk about what we do not see when we look at human variation. And so what we do not see is what we might consider deep genetic differences among human beings. Stuff that goes back even 1,000,000 years or millions of years, or large alterations to the genetic code which make one human quite different from the rest, or different groups of humans different from each other. So we don't see this deep evolutionary human difference. We also do not see that human groups come as rigidly bounded categories. As I told you, if you walk or travel between different human groups across a geographical range, what you're going to see is a gradual variation in terms of skin color and body shape and eye color, lactose tolerance. What you're not going to get is that you suddenly crossed a river and you're in the land of the tall people now. Sure, people on average are going to be taller or shorter, but you're always going to see one variation within any human population. We talked about in the last class how 85% of human genetic variation is going to be within any local human population. But you're also going to see, again, this gradual difference. So that people might be getting taller or shorter as you go along the range, but it's not going to be, I crossed the railroad tracks and all of a sudden I'm in the land of the small foot people. These boundaries are fluid and we mix up a lot. And again, as we talked about, we do not see is, yes, you see traits clump up in certain regions. So you'll go to certain regions of the world and there really aren't any people with blonde hair in this part of the world. They're just not there generally unless they've migrated there. So things tend to clump up or accumulate in certain regions. But as people mix together, those packages are not contained. So if somebody with black hair and somebody with super red hair or blonde hair get together, then that's going to get mixed up in different ways and you're going to get a different mixing of traits. Again, in part because of how complex human sexual reproduction mechanisms are in terms of the genetics. We talked about not only the gamete reshuffling, but the crossing over of gametes during the reshuffling process. It's a complex way in which we pass on our traits. Now, I have a couple questions for you, which hopefully will help you on the next exam. First of all, I will be going on and on about how, like, for example, lactose tolerance, you have people with dark skin that can be lactose tolerant, and people with light skin that can be lactose tolerant, and some people with dark skin that are and aren't, and the malaria resistance and all these things. I'm going to be telling you about that these things do not come as some bounded package of traits. Why will I be going on and on about this? About that just because you have a certain nose shape doesn't mean you're going to have a certain lactose tolerance. Why am I going to be boring you to death with how human traits don't come as one package of things that we can draw boundaries around? Izzy, a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about in terms of human biological variation is variation that we don't think about very much, but it is important variation. And I'm trying to tell you that it doesn't map on, it doesn't correspond with other traits. Let me give you once again, there's going to be people with very dark skin that are lactose tolerant and people with super light skin that are lactose tolerant. Why am I going to be talking about that on and on and on? If you thought from some physical trait that you could identify something about them just by looking at them, what's that called? When we look at somebody and we see from their physical traits and then we make assumptions about them, about the way they are, based on physical traits that we can see. Yes, it is a stereotype, but it's a particular stereotype, which almost all of you have to answer on a census form. What is one of the primary stereotypes that we make about people? And we say, hey, because you look like this, race. we assume that certain people, because of the color of their skin, are going to have other traits and that those are linked together as a package. And so what I'm trying to tell you is that that's not the way human variation works. Now, let's be careful. I'm not trying to tell you that people are all the same. That people are very varied and very different, but our variation is not captured by our ideas about biological race groups. That actually doesn't map well onto the full range of human variation that we see. So that's the first thing. Exactly. The other thing is a week from today, we're going to go back 8 million years in human evolution. We're going to go back to bipedalism and what happened 8 million years ago. Why are we going on and on about human variation in today's world and all this recent stuff before we go back 8 million years ago? Why didn't we just start 8 million years ago and then go chronologically speaking? Why did we have to talk about this stuff now before we did 8 million years ago? Yes, we definitely want to frame our thinking. Because if we didn't frame our thinking, we are very race caught up in our society. It's the one question that you all have to answer on the census, in addition to a few other questions, is what race or races do you consider yourself to be? This has been a big deal in our society, the idea of race. And if we just went back 8 million years ago without discussing when this stuff emerged, people would be looking for the Chinese back 8 million years ago. They'd be looking for race ideas long time ago. So what I'm trying to tell you here is these ideas, these physical differences, one, they're pretty recent. They're not 8 million years ago, and they don't correspond to the full range of biological variability. So I am trying to give you a framework in the terms of clearing out our existing framework and our stereotypes so that we can actually go back 8 million years ago and not be looking for races back then, because you won't find them. The idea of race is actually a very recent human invention. It actually only comes to us in the last 500 years that people started to group people together according to race. And again, it doesn't capture the full range of human biological variation. Now, again, I want to be careful. We're very different from each other, biologically different. We can look around and see, I'm not trying to say we're not biologically different. I'm just trying to say that doesn't get captured by our notion of race. So on the next exam, there will be a question. The hypothetical question is something like this. One of your relatives says, hey, you're taking an anthropology class? Did you learn about how the races evolved? And the last time I taught this class, while the exam was in progress, the student ran down to my office and were like, we didn't talk about race, professor. What's the deal? Yes, we are not talking about race. But what you'll be able to say to your relative, hypothetically on the exam, is that we learned that yes, humans are biologically varied, but that's not because of some deep evolutionary difference that happened a long time ago that gave us this idea of race today. So you'll be able to do that. In the first part of this class, we'll be talking about the basic genetic changes that have occurred as people moved into different regions. So your textbook gives you one example of something that people are varied in. We don't always think about, but there are some people who are more compact than others, stockier, and some people who are lankier than others and maybe taller. The textbook gives you an example of, here are some people from the Inuit people, and here's some people from the Maasai people in Africa. So the polar north, and what's going on there. So there's a couple of things that they call rules here. Bergman's rule, and they also talk about Allen's rule, and these people who made rules about how body shape develops. And the basic idea of this is that if you are in hotter climates, you want the heat to dissipate from your body, so it's good to be lankier, it's good to be skinnier and taller and shorter limbed. But if you have migrated to a very cold climate, it might be more adaptive to be stockier. Now, again, this only happened in the last 50,000 years that people have been living in extreme cold climates as opposed to some of the hot climates. And I would just caution you that although these are called rules, you have to be careful with the idea that these are absolute rules. Your textbook says that yes, there's Bergmann's rule and there's Allen's rule. But in fact, these are both, it's fairly recently that humans migrated to cold climates. For most of our evolutionary history, we were in warmer environments. And that means that there's not just two body type categories. Or to give you a fuller quote, they say that there's a spectrum of average body shapes seen among humans today that reflect many adaptations to specific regional climates. So again, as I said, this is a gradual or a clinal change across a range. It is not just two body shapes. I emphasizing this because it seems like you didn't, at least in your web comments, you didn't get way too into these rules. In the last class I taught, people got way into these body rules and talking about stocky people and skinny people and wondering where they came from. These are more like guidelines or things that might happen over time to your body if you spend many generations living in either a very cold or a very hot climate. We've talked a little bit, made a little bit of noise here about skin color, or what technically might be termed skin reflectance, melanin. So we have some people who are melanin deprived, some people who have more melanin than others. What's the pattern here? What are those environmental factors? You want more melanin if it's more intense. Yes. So on the one hand, you have UV protection, and then if you live in the northern climates, why might you want to have maybe be a little bit more melanin deprived? Why might people have given up their sun reflectance, skin reflectance? Now, I know you can't voluntarily do it, but why might that have evolved differently as people were in the northern parts? Yes, we can call it the lack of sunlight. Those of us who grew up in upstate New York are perfectly allowed to call it a lack of sunlight. What happens when you have a lack of sunlight? Vitamin D absorption. It does matter for vitamin D absorption. So there's actually a double clinal gradient going on here. One is because you're hoping to get protection from the sun when you're nearer to the equator. But the other is if you're in northern climates, it's perhaps advantageous sometimes to be able to absorb more vitamin D. And so that seems to be the pattern of why people develop different skin reflectance. Now, again, this is a clinal variation. This is a gradual variation. This is not somewhere where you cross some river and you're like, aha, I'm in the land of the white people now. If you walk along this path from, say, northern Europe down into tropical Africa, you will see all along the way a gradual variation in skin tone. The same thing if you walk from east to west along Eurasia, you'll see a gradual variation in skin changes, eye form changes, those kinds of things. There's not one line at which you cross like, aha, I'm in the land of the Asian people now. It's a gradual variation across and up and down this range. And even within certain parts of the world, let's say India, for example, there's often a large variation between people who are Indian but have very light skin and people who are Indian but have very dark skin. And so skin color is one of those traits that is perfectly clinal. You can line up all the people in the world and they'll vary from very light to very dark. And there's not a line that you can draw and be like, okay, here is the line of the brown people. So skin reflectance, body type, we're dealing with genetic changes that we can see. Sickle cell trait is another genetic variation. It appears at the level of our genes. It is also a natural selection adaptation, which is to say that so sickle cell trait changes the shape of some of your blood cells. And if you have sickle cell trait heterozygously, or it arises around areas where there is malaria. So malaria is a mosquito-transmitted disease. It is often enhanced by places in which there was agriculture and irrigation, and so the irrigation levels developed more mosquito populations. And so in these populations, a very the malaria got transmitted. It's a very deadly and debilitating disease. And in these areas, there were mutations which allowed for the rise of what we call sickle cell trait, which does, it's named that way because it makes your blood cells kind of look like a sickle. And if you are heterozygous for that, that is to say, if you've got one dominant and one recessive for sickle cell, it confers malaria resistance. So it's actually a very adaptive trait in areas where malaria is a problem. However, the problem is, so this is one of those traits that is adaptive, but it's also very maladaptive because if you're unlucky enough to be homozygous for the sickle cell trait, it can actually kill you or be very debilitating itself. So one out of it, if you do your Punnett squares in an area where this might be adaptive, it is also going to be very harmful to say 1 out of 4 of the people in that population. So in places where there is not malaria, if you have happened to have been raised in a place where there is malaria and then migrate to or are forced to leave and go to another place where there isn't malaria, it can be very maladaptive to you to have sickle cell trait. In fact, some people call it sickle cell disease because it is not good for you if you don't have to fight off malaria. Now, this brings up a very important point to us, which we talked about in the last class, but I just want to emphasize. The concept of fitness and what kinds of individuals, evolutionarily speaking, are going to make it to the next generation is always depends on the environment. There is not anything that is absolutely fit or absolutely unfit. It depends upon the environment. And as the environment changes, that adaptation can change from being adaptive to being maladaptive. And so again, we get this phrase survival of the fittest in our head, but it only refers to within a given environment, and it can change over time. Now, I just want to show you a little bit about how this works. So this is basically where malaria is in the world, where it's been in terms of, again, often places where irrigation occurs. And as you can see, that pretty much perfectly maps onto the sickle cell trait or the HBS allele distribution of the world. Now, in the United States, we have often linked sickle cell trait to race. We often say that sickle cell, we use it as a marker of, or we say it's a race trait or a race-based disease. Why would we do that in the United States? Why have people done that in the United States? Link sickle cell to race. For those of you who know your history of how different people got to the United States, this map should tell you all that you need to know. Most of the people who were enslaved and brought to the United States came from this region of West Africa, and it was also one of the highest rates of sickle cell trait. And so in the minds of the United Statesians, this became linked to the idea of race. Now, people in other parts of Africa who also have dark skin do not have sickle cell trait. And people in areas like Greece and Turkey and Cyprus and even parts of Saudi Arabia who have light skin sometimes have sickle cell trait. But because we don't have high percentages of those people in the United States, we often don't think about that. Same thing in India. In India, there is also, again, going along with irrigation and malaria, there are areas where there are high sickle cell trait concentrations. Again, it is not a race-based trait. It is something that comes about whenever there are populations exposed to malaria, and then this becomes perhaps adaptive. But again, since we don't, in the United States, this has not been an area of high migration, we don't see people like that. And so we often take certain traits because of the people we see, and we map them onto what we consider to be race. But if you look more broadly across the world, you can see that something like sickle cell does not depend at all on skin tone. It only depends on where people are in terms of malaria. So those are a few different things, a few different traits that are basically genetically determined, that we can see that vary gradually over a range or clinal variation. They're not packaged together as traits. Body shape, malaria resistance, skin reflectance don't come together as traits. They vary gradually. And again, all of them arose within the last 50,000 years, so relatively recent in human evolution.